Hi everyone, my name's John Nicholson. I work at Altech Environmental Consulting. I'm here in our offices in Toronto. It's noon, and as promised, we're having our webinar on Phase 1 ESAs, Environmental Site Assessments 1.5, which we feel is important to the community that engages in consultants doing Phase 1 and Phase 2 environmental site assessments. It's really new technology that's available and we think is being underutilized. So that's why we're putting on this webinar. And for this webinar today, we have two great speakers, both with over 20 years experience, very knowledgeable people that give you sound advice. I told them that not to speak in too scientifically or too engineering, make sure that it's understandable to the average person. They both agreed. And if they don't hold up their end of the bargain, I'll give them a stern lecture at the end of this webinar. Couple ground rules or housekeeping matters. Certainly open to questions during the webinar because it's supposed to be a learning session for people. So if you have any questions, either you can type your questions in the chat function or in the Q&A function. Either way, don't worry, we're not going to say who you are. Like, I can't remember, some advertisements say there's no stupid questions, so you can ask your questions. Don't worry if they're stupid. Now, if I snicker while I'm answering it, then you think you might get the idea that it might not be the most intelligent, but don't be afraid of asking questions, any type of questions as the webinar approaches, if I think it's appropriate to be answered in the context of the speakers, we'll answer it then. Otherwise, we'll keep it till the end. We do have we have made time for question and answer session at the end. The other thing is I'm the moderator, so I'll try to keep things on track. The one thing I try to pride myself in is ending webinars on time, which is in this case 1 o'clock. So we would definitely be finished by 1 o'clock, because I know it will be, because I have another webinar that actually starts at 1. And the other thing is this is being recorded. And so that you love it so much and you want to watch it again, there will be an opportunity to watch it again on Alltech Environmental's YouTube channel. All right, and we'll give you information on that pending after the webinar. So the first speaker is Chad, followed by Matthew. Chad Stewart is, and I can't remember Chad's title, I should remember it, but he's a big important person when it comes to Phase 1, Phase 2s. Chad, maybe you can introduce yourself, because I don't have you right up here in front of me. But he's a big important person when it comes to Phase 1, Phase 2 environmental site assessments, been doing them forever. He's got a new title, that's why I've forgotten it, or don't remember it. But Chad, why don't you go? Chad's going to be talking for 20 minutes. Then Matthew's going to talk, and between Chad and Matthew, I'll introduce Matthew. So Chad, why don't you give a little bit about yourself before you?
Sure. Thanks, John. Let me share my screen here to get things rolling. And I'm the practice leader at Alltech. My area of expertise is in property due diligence, investigation, and remediation. And to kick off the presentation here, I'm going to talk a little bit about Alltech and the type of projects that we do, the expertise that we have, and get into our topic that we want to talk about, and that is Phase 1.5, Phase 1 ESA and a half, which is sort of an enhanced version of a Phase 1 ESA that we think is key for the environmental site assessment service. Okay, so here we go, slide 1. So Alltech Environmental Consulting is been around a long time. We were established in the mid-'80s, and our focus is on engineering and environmental consulting. And we have a wide variety of expertise on staff. As I mentioned, I'm the practice leader for environmental site assessment, property due diligence, and we have other practice leaders in other areas, such as permitting and compliance and technology, wastewater treatment technology, and other types of technologies. And our slogan here is that we help businesses expertly identify and resolve environmental challenges, establish due diligence, and stay in compliance. And that's really what our focus has been, is to help firms that have environmental challenges achieve compliance, and particularly with property transactions, establish the appropriate due diligence for their needs around the property transaction. So I've touched on these already, but I want to dive into these a little bit more. Property due diligence, investigation, remediation, that's my area of expertise, and that's where Phase 1 ESA comes in. We have other areas of expertise, as I mentioned, permitting and compliance, where we do projects like environmental compliance auditing, environmental compliance approval application, federal pollution reporting, and things like that. And we also have another area of expertise in decarbonization and resource efficiency. Alltech is part of a larger firm called CHAR Technologies, and we have various technologies associated with that, such as pyrolysis, biocarbon production, and treatment systems for a variety of media. So in the realm of property due diligence, investigation, remediation, what we're talking about is transaction and financing due diligence. So in circumstances where people are buying and selling property, getting financing for doing that, the key element to this is Phase 1 environmental site assessment. Whenever someone's getting financing to purchase a property and taking on property ownership themselves, they want to make sure that they cover the appropriate due diligence and they understand what environmental concerns they may be accepting in looking at the property. So the basic concept of a Phase 1 is gathering information about a site and making a professional judgment about potential environmental concerns of the site. Things like contamination, areas of non-compliance, occupant exposure potentially for occupants that are using the property. And in circumstances where an environmental concern is identified, then follow-up investigation is warranted, and that's what Phase 2 ESA is. It's basically confirming or denying whether real contamination exists at the property. And the way we do that is by collecting samples of various media, soil, groundwater, etc., and analyzing those for chemical parameters to see if there's exceedance of established standard by the provincial ministry. And in circumstances where there may be exceedances for various chemicals, then delineation of the contaminant is necessary to determine how big the issue is. And sometimes remediation or risk assessment is required to either remove the contaminant from the property or develop risk mitigation measures, which would come out of a formalized risk assessment. Now, the other aspect here is with land development, and we deal with developers as well. And where a property is being developed into a more sensitive use, then that's where the provincial ministry requires a record of site condition to be done. And we have a few professionals here at Alltech that have the qualified person designation in order to do that. And that's another aspect of the ESA market that's critical, and we think would be interested in the Phase 1 ESA and a half that we're talking about today. Now, before I get into a bit more detail about Phase 1, maybe we can go to the poll questions. We have a few questions to direct to the audience of the webinar, and maybe we can get those up on the screen and participants can respond.
Thanks, Chad. We're waiting for the poll questions to come up. The reason we're doing these poll questions are twofold. One is because we like to keep the audience engaged, for sure. So, and the secondly is just to get feedback on what's happening. So the two questions that we have is one, how many property transactions have you or your firm been involved in the last 2 years? Don't want to answer, that's fine. Um, and then the second one is how many of the property transactions that you have been involved in have required environmental site assessment. It's my experience that any commercial industrial business transaction and financing involves some sort of due diligence and typically phase one environmental site assessments. I know certain developers won't do any development unless there's a record of site condition on the property because the lenders that they utilize won't do it. So, but there certainly is a segment of the market that will uh, take on higher risk types of properties, i.e., contaminated properties, with the knowledge of knowing how much is in there, etc. So I think that's enough time for people to answer this question. So I'm going to end the polling. I think I have the ability. So the results speak for themselves. Or there's no harm in knowing exactly how many you've done, etc. And that's part of the reason for being here. And then secondly, of the ones that responded, 100% are for property transactions. Chad, quick question while we're going on. Have you
Sure.
seen phase one environmental site assessments on residential properties?
Yes, it is relatively rare, but it certainly is done. Things like high-rise apartments, things like older residential that's particularly in the downtown core, older residential that's been converted into other uses. Those get phase ones fairly regularly, and residential that maybe the financer or the buyer or seller has been tipped, if you will, that there might be a concern there. For example, an old fuel tank for heating. Those are the most common scenarios, but most of the properties that we assess are in the commercial and industrial space, and things like multi-tenant commercial plazas, all the way up to large industries, manufacturing and manufacturing that's operational now, and manufacturing that's derelict and formerly was used for that purpose, but is maybe vacant or used for a different purpose. So let's get into the phase one ESA. I want to talk a little bit more detail about this, and then talk about the phase 1.5 concept. Now, for a phase one, a due diligence ESA is typically performed to the Canadian Standards Association methodology, and there's generally two report formats that exist. The CSA standard has one, and there's another different report format and content that's specified in the Record of Site Condition Regulation 153. And when you're preparing a record of site condition, it's a requirement that you follow the report format in the regulation. And as we've mentioned before, when you're redeveloping a property to a more sensitive use, for example, industrial commercial into residential, then it's a legal requirement that you get the RSC done. Now, in terms of there are disadvantages to the standard phase 1 and 2 ESA approach, and what we've seen in our experience is with property transactions and completing due diligence ESAs, the key issue is timing. It does take some time to complete a phase 1, usually about a week or two, but where there is environmental concern that needs to be investigated further, the phase 2 can be costly and can be more time consuming, and that stretches it up to several weeks, say 4, 5, 6 weeks to do. And What we're keying in on here is an alternative approach to phase one, where as professionals, when we're gathering information about a property, there's several types of information that we might obtain. Anecdotal, for example, people simply telling us things about the property. You can get written information, which comes from our records review that we do as part of the phase one. And you can get visual information from the Alltech professional visiting the site and looking with their own eyes at clues and features that may be there at the site that might indicate a concern. And when we're evaluating information, it sometimes is not absolutely reliable. And sometimes there's some question as to whether a particular underground feature might be there. For example, an underground storage tank or piping or various other things. And what we found is a great tool to bolt on to the phase one, if you will, is ground penetrating radar. And we've used this in the recent past, and we found that it's very effective for giving more concrete information about what the underground conditions are and what underground structures might be there. The two key points with this are at the bottom of the slide there, providing greater certainty on whether USTs, underground storage tanks, and other underground structures are present or not. And where this comes into play and is important, in addition to that, is pinpointing where an ESA might be focused. And we'll talk a little bit more later in the webinar about how that can impact the phase two process and provide an advantage. Go to the next slide here. There we go. So some potential liabilities that might be uncovered during a phase one. You've got underground storage tanks and piping, which are sometimes evidenced at the surface of the site, but not always. And it comes down to the experience and expertise of the assessor who's visiting the site to identify these things. There may also be buried debris, such as drums containing chemicals, derelict piping from old underground systems, or solid wastes. And there may also be infilling with low quality soil, which can be a contaminant source at a property and cause issues down the road, particularly for development or redevelopment. And some examples of this might be soil that has high metal content, soil that maybe has granular asphalt in it, slag, or other solid wastes. And the key point here is that these features, these liabilities, may not be evidenced to the assessor during the inspection. So there is a real consequence if features are missed and if the information that the assessor is relying on to make their conclusions is not reliable. And that's where ground penetrating radar comes in. Our colleague Matthew is going to talk a little bit about that. And I'm going to put it over to the next slide for Matt.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Chad. I appreciate the handover. I want to thank everyone else coming out to this webinar today to learn a little bit more about what GPR has to offer. So I'll try to make it as easy as possible. I'll get to the meat and gravies of what GPR is. So as the acronym stands out for, it does mean ground penetrating radar. GPR is not necessarily a new piece of technology. It's been around for some time, but over the course of the years, it's definitely a trending technology. The concept of GPR is the ability to emit radio waves into the ground until they penetrate and obviously hit subsurface objects, buried objects, pipes, PVC, metallic and non-metallic properties. And then basically these waves come back to the actual GPR itself. It's digitized and it presents to you a waveform image. So basically, the GPR is 3 components. You have a battery power supply, then you have a control unit and an antenna. The control unit is basically designed to generate radar pulses that go into the ground. But before they do, they get amplified by the antenna. The antennas can be anywhere from low to high frequencies, and they depend on penetration depths that you're after. So the nice thing about GPRs is non-intrusive, non-destructive piece of technology that basically allows you to get your data not only on the spot, but also allows you to make those assessments much quicker. The most common GPR used as of today is shown on the bottom left, basically the unit that has, that almost looks like a lawnmower. So in using the GPR, it's very simple. If you've ever mowed the lawn, it's identical to using a GPR. You basically make cross sections with the GPR, and in those cross sections, again, the radar waves are emitted into the ground and refracted back off the objects to the unit. The images that are presented, as I mentioned, in a waveform, and you can see a very present picture of what we see with rebarb, pipe, and then pipe with water. So once you get more familiar with the type of reflections that you'll be seeing with the GPRs, and you can start making these easy assessments that, hey, we do have pipes in the ground. Hey, we do still have pipes with water, and much more. One of the things that just kind of blew me away with the trending technology of GPR is that it's very easy technology. Once you get familiar with how to comprehend the data and figure out what the images actually mean, like I said, your assessments are made within the scanning time, so which is really nice. One of the things I'd like to, if you wouldn't mind, Chad, if going to the next page there.
Sure.
So these are kind of the type of images that you would be receiving if you were just doing quick 2D scans in the field. But GPR technology has improved so that you actually do get 3D scans. So you can actually see what a fully submerged tank would look like in the ground, rather so much more than just the waveform data that's presented on the right-hand side here. However, that waveform data that you see allows you to assess the subsurface objects much quicker. And at that point, everybody wants everything done as quickly as soon as possible. But yeah, as I mentioned, there are 3D grid scans available. This is really nice because, as mentioned in one of the slides, Chad had mentioned storage tanks. Well, one of the things that GPRs can also do is not just identify buried storage tanks, but if there is a leak, that leak, what it does, the way GPR works is basically the radio waves are enhanced through electrical medium. So the electrical medium, let's just say leaking oil goes into the ground, it increases. You can actually see that on the spot with the GPR. So not only are you finding the objects, you could also be identifying the additional hazards involved as well. On top of that, like I had mentioned, some of the benefits was like non-destructive, non-intrusive. It's very cost effective, and there's absolutely no health hazards other than some exercise by moving the device.
I do know from experience that it's much more exciting than mowing the lawn.
Much more than mowing the lawn, exactly. And if you haven't mowed the lawn, and this is good practice for it as well. So all the more merrier. But yeah, like you had mentioned, Chad, once you get the experience of using GPR as a technology that you can't turn away from, over the years I've been with that Pine. It's a trending piece of technology that we've seen. It's you know, it's very innovative, and not only that, it's growing. As I mentioned, there are 3D scans available So those are really nice to determine not only all the subsurface objects, but to also determine if there are, filled with contaminants or if contaminants are leaking.
Okay.
So yeah, that's basically the gist of what GPR is. It is a lot more in depth, but hopefully those are the mean gravy to the understanding of what GPR is. If you guys have any questions at all, by any means, please drop a question in messages below. I'd be more than happy to answer anything.
Thanks, Matt.
Perfect.
I'm going to go to the
Thank
next
you.
slide. I'm going to go to the next slide here and just touch on kind of summarizing some of the things that Matt and I have talked about so far. So the key is that I think Matt has demonstrated how useful a tool it is in conjunction with phase ones. And it is relatively easy to use and cost effective. And as you can see in the previous slides, the units are relatively small, easy to mobilize to the site and use. And they, as Matt mentioned, that not only identifying underground structures, but contaminant sources and even contamination that has been released. Now, what I want to talk a little bit about is that the GPR scanning, it helps to save money on intrusive investigations. And I do have a case study coming up to talk a little bit more about that. GPR can make intrusive investigations more efficient and cost effective. Typically, a phase two, when you're doing a phase two at a property, a very common approach is to basically evaluate the entire site, distribute your sampling scheme across the entire site, which sometimes can be very expensive. And if you have GPR to use as a tool, you can narrow down your focus on what you're investigating, and you can save money. And the key is that the goal here is always protecting property owners from environmental liabilities. With that in mind, I want to go to the next slide and talk a little about this case study from a project that we recently did. So this is a property in North Toronto. We did a phase one here a little while ago. This is a site that clearly you could tell from walking through it that it was a former industrial manufacturing site, fairly heavy industry. And at the time that the phase one was done, this place was repurposed. All the manufacturing had been gone, and this was repurposed as an office and meeting hall. And the occupants that we interviewed, the people available that we interviewed, didn't really have much information about the former operations. We knew that they had extensive liquid chemicals storage at the site based on records. We didn't really have too much other information. And we knew that the chemicals had to be stored somewhere. We had a general idea of where that might be. But what we decided to do was add ground penetrating radar to the assessment. And you can see in the image there in the top right, there's a photo, kind of a two-part photo, and you can see the little GPR, what would you call it, Matt? A carriage or a wheeled device there?
You know what? Yeah, actually, carriage was actually definitely the term used for holding the control unit there. So yeah, definitely a carriage would work.
Yeah. And up in the top left corner of the photo is the image that the GPR device gives you, so you can see what the subsurface condition is, and you can tell what's going on down in the subsurface. So with this particular site, the GPR was very effective in helping us narrow down where to investigate. And we did do some strategically placed soil sampling, and we saved about a week in total from the time we started at the property till our final report. And we estimate that we saved about $5,000 off the cost of the phase two. The GPR was a big part of that. It was relatively inexpensive to add on to the phase one, and it really helped us focus our phase two. And instead of covering the entire property, we were able to narrow down to a particular area that needed investigation, and we were able to do that. So I thought that was a good example of a project, a recent project where GPR was a key aspect. So to wrap up, I got contact information there for myself and for the other qualified person that Alltech has, Naveed Rahman. And we want to thank everybody for attending the webinar, and happy to answer any questions that anybody might have.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Chad and Matt. And I was remiss in my introduction of Matt in his area of expertise. So I'm just going to read it off here.
Yeah, thank you. Okay.
So Matt works for Pine Environmental Services, and Pine is a leading equipment provider in both the United States and in Canada for environmental monitoring, non-destructive testing, visual inspection, and continuous emissions monitoring.
Very
systems.
important equipment partner for Alltech.
Yes. He's a graduate from the Instrumentation Engineering Technology program at Northern Alberta Institute of Technology, which is a very well-respected college. Anyone knows any graduates from there in that space knows that it's a very highly regarded institute. He has operated out of Pine Environmental, the Edmonton location. So I assume he's an Edmonton Oilers fan. You are, right?
It's born in blood.
Okay. Since joining them in 2016, he has a vast knowledge of non-destructive and remote visual inspection, including field experience on various projects, including Synovus, Husky, Penn West, and a bunch of other major players. So he knows what he's talking about. Okay, so we do have some questions. So Chad and Matthew, I hope you're ready for them.
Ready.
So I'm just going to read them
Sure.
off, and then whoever wants to take the lead. And if neither of you do, I'll pick one of you. And some of these questions, maybe people weren't listening. Because they seem to be, they already answered. But like I said, there's no stupid questions, right? Remember, I already said that. So, okay, so this is, what is the turnaround time for a phase 1.5 ESA? So I think what they're getting about is it going to slow the process down? Because anyone who knows developers is they have very short attention spans, and they want everything done immediately.
Yeah,
and they're also asking, is it possible to get the results within 1 day?
I can handle this one. Now, one of the points that makes GPR attractive is that it doesn't add much time to the turnaround for a phase 1. Our general rule of thumb is 10 business days to complete a phase 1, and I don't see any reason why having a GPR unit out at the site would add any time to that. And to answer the second part of that question, we do get requests from time to time to get the client an idea of our assessment prior to, on a short-term basis, so prior to us compiling all the information into a report. So, we have been able to get back to the client relatively quickly after the site visit and give them an idea of what the concerns might be. So yes, we can certainly do that, 24 to 48 hours after doing the site work.
Okay, here's another question. If an underground storage tank is discovered or suspected to be discovered during your GPR, is it possible to also do some sort of excavation that day? So that must be a developer question, because they want everything done that day.
In order to do excavation, we would have to clear utility locates. So that does take some time. So unfortunately, I don't think we could do the scanning and the excavation unless we had planned it prior to, which I suppose is possible, but generally it's, once we once we determine the phase 2 scope, then we need time to clear the utilities before we get into any intrusive work.
And in Ontario, that's the one call, right?
Yes,
That's what you
and
use.
private utility locating as
Yeah.
well, yeah.
And Matthew, I'm just curious, what's it in Alberta to get the locates?
You know what? That is a good question that I don't have on the top of my
Oh,
head,
that's fine.
unfortunately.
Well, you're non-intrusive, so you don't care.
Yeah, that's the GIF. Yeah, I guess. Yeah, ideally we're just more there, like in terms of doing the assessment. But as Chad was mentioning, I mean, in figuring out what utilities are active or not, and what lines are there, you supposedly could have the GPR on site with an excavator, but again, everything will have to be regulated. So, you know, there's definitely always the advantage of having GPR on site anyways, before and after the fact. So it definitely makes the ideal an advantage for sure.
Okay, next question. If I need a record of site condition, and for those who don't know, a record of site condition is typically needed for a more sensitive land use. So if you're doing a redevelopment of an industrial and you want to turn it to residential, which is extremely popular here in the GTA, you need a record of site condition. Is that correct, Chad?
Yes.
So if I need a record of site condition, which is a public document, you can go on the internet and find out all the records of site conditions that ever existed since 2004. Okay, so if I need one, this is a developer asking, if I need one, does a phase 1.5 get me further ahead or towards that? Because, you know, most developers just want to get that record of site condition, and then everything leading up to that is just time and money. So Chad or Matthew or both.
It certainly does. So an RSC, a record of site condition, has to be based on, as a minimum, a phase 1. And where the phase 1.5 comes in as an advantage is in a circumstance where maybe information is not certain, and having the GPR added on to the phase 1 resolves any environmental concerns. That definitely gets you farther ahead. And as we discussed earlier in the webinar, it can shorten the time period to get to the end of result. Even if a phase 2 is needed, it shortens the time period to get to the end result of whatever the subsurface conditions are.
That's right.
All right, next question must have been someone who had a false positive on their COVID test. Because they're asking, does the GPR give false positives? Like says there's something present that subsequently was found not to be present.
No, so I guess the only limitation that GPR has is if the surface or the ground is after a heavy rainfall, then the radio waves actually attenuate a little bit. But in terms of finding like substructures and stuff like that, the radio waves won't attenuate that much. But no, you definitely don't get false positives. You're always going to find, if something is in the ground and you find it, there's indeed something there.
Okay, super. All right, with respect to savings on a phase 2, what could that be? And I think you guys answered that in the presentation, but just to reiterate that.
Mm-hmm. So in the case study, we figure it came in around 5,000. It's variable, of course, site to site, but the key thing is that for a relatively inexpensive GPR, the savings at the phase 2 side could be significant. So, I would, for the purpose of this discussion, maybe say an average would be about 5,000.
Yeah, well, it's my experience. Before I joined Alltech, just as a point of reference, I did work at a law firm as an in-house environmental engineer. So I did get to see a lot of environmental reports. And I know certain consultants, I will remain unnamed, certainly not Alltech, would Swiss cheese a site. And that's a term used in environmental consulting where they would just put a borehole down every 5 meters. So you'd have like, I don't know, 20 boreholes on a site. Whereas if you did it this way, this 1.5, you might end up with what, 3, 4, less than 5, and at a borehole cost of what are we talking about? 1,000, 1,500 per borehole?
Yeah, say 1,500 each.
Yeah, 1,500 per each. That's a significant savings, and there's no justification for Swiss cheesing a site. So, Matthew, that's a term that you use out in Alberta too, Swiss cheesing a site.
Wow.
Yeah, that's a scientific term for too many boreholes. Okay, those are all the questions. So I'm happy that we finished early, so that makes me feel good. The one thing that I'd like to add is we don't have, and this is an oversight, Matthew's contact information. If someone wants to contact Matthew directly, so Matthew's, you just internet search Pine Environmental. I'm sure you'll find it. But his email address is Lehnert, LEHNERT at pine-environmental.com. Either Google search or Bing or some other one. I'm not going to favor any internet search over another. And I'm sure it'll turn up. Or you can contact Chad or Naveed, and they'll pass that on if you have anything directly you want to ask.
I appreciate it.
Sure.
Other than that, I think that concludes it. I do not see any other questions. So both Chad and Matthew, thank you very much for your time. For the participants, thank you for participating. This will be included on the YouTube channel for Alltech. Give us a few days to do that, to clean it up. I don't think there was any offensive language or anything, so it'll be pretty quick to clean it up before we post it. So have a great Wednesday afternoon, everybody, and we can all get back to work. Thank you and goodbye.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.